Euh, je vous remercie d'avoir répondu à notre invitation d'Albin Michel et du Point pour célébrer la nouvelle venue, puisqu'il était déjà venu à Paris lors de Homo Deus, pour la nouvelle venue de Yuval Harari, à l'occasion de la sortie de son nouveau livre 21 leçons pour le XXIe siècle. Yuval est un phénomène, comme vous le savez, assez unique, un phénomène mondial. C'est un succès extraordinaire. Savez-vous que pour son premier livre, Sapiens, 3 ans après, on en a encore vendu 10 000 dans la semaine, ce qui est assez unique, ce que je n'ai jamais vu dans 40 ans d'édition. Et alors pourquoi ce succès? Alors bien entendu, à cause de l'intelligence, de l'esprit de synthèse, de clarté, de l'accessibilité des livres de Yuval qui a un esprit de synthèse tout à fait extraordinaire. Mais je pense aussi qu'il signifie beaucoup de choses et en particulier l'inquiétude générale de tous les citoyens français et tous les hommes qui habitent sur notre planète pour savoir justement d'où nous venons, qu'est-ce qui va nous arriver, quel est notre futur et quel est le sens de la vie. Alors nous allons parler, je vais sortir mon papier parce que j'ai noté quelques petits mots pour... nous allons parler des défis technologiques, mais ça il en a déjà parlé, de l'intelligence, pardon, c'est vrai, de l'intelligence artificielle, de l'homme augmenté, mais aussi les défis politiques, les nationalismes, la religion, l'avenir des civilisations. Je ne vais pas citer une phrase bien connue. Toutes les civilisations sont mortelles. Les guerres, des religions, de l'immigration, de Dieu, de l'ignorance, de l'éducation, et on en revient évidemment au sens de la vie. Donc, je voudrais, avant de laisser la parole à Gaspard Koenig, écrivain et philosophe que vous connaissez tous aussi, qui va animer cette réunion et dialoguer avec Yuval Harari, je voudrais dire juste un petit mot et remercier Albin Michel, qui la première a su flairer, comment dire, connaître cet écrivain qui était professeur d'histoire au département de l'université hébraïque de Jérusalem, docteur en philosophie également, et donc son premier livre est paru en Israël, alors que personne ne le connaissait, et je dois reconnaître que pour un éditeur, ça mérite quand même une mention très particulière d'avoir su saisir de cet auteur d'une manière particulière. Voilà. Bon, donc on va laisser la parole à Gaspard Koenig, mais avant, Étienne Gernel va vous dire un mot, qui est le directeur du Point sur Gaspard Koenig. Voilà. Qui a d'ailleurs fait déjà beaucoup de choses sur Harari, sur le Point, et qui, je crois, va continuer. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Francis. En un mot, je laisse parler. Gaspard Koenig est un essayiste, philosophe. Alors, il est difficile à décrire, on le dit libéral, libertaire, on ne sait pas. De toute façon, en France, comme c'est à moitié un gros mot, ça rejette dans une sphère un peu étrange. Mais surtout, c'est un philosophe qui se mouille, qui va sur le terrain. Il avait fait une série récemment pour nous sur les aventuriers de la liberté, où il est allé voir les fumeurs de hashish, les vendeurs de drogue, et même l'OMC. Et il se trouve que donc il fait du reportage, il va voir les gens, on peut réfléchir aussi en se déplaçant. Il se trouve, me semble-t-il, tu m'arrêtes si je me trompe, que tu as rencontré Yuval précisément dans l'enquête que tu as réalisée pour une série à venir dans le Point, un voyage au pays de l'intelligence artificielle. Voilà, donc c'est le philosophe qui se mouille, qui va interviewer l'intellectuel le plus écouté au monde. Il a même fait la une du Point, c'est dire. Et donc on attend ça avec délectation. Merci à vous deux et on vous laisse la parole.
I mean, you shook many of my beliefs. First of all, I read in your book that the cuckoo clock comes from Germany, not from Switzerland, which was sort of a shock. And then you're analyzing artificial intelligence as a technology that in a way suppresses or inhibits the exercise of agency, the exercise of free will. And to me that's really a starting point, because if there is no free will, then there is no liberalism, then I'm out of business, you know. So it's a rather serious issue. But before we venture into that, I wanted to ask something about, I mean, as a historian, maybe you can help us understand your own success. Francis Esmena, when mentioning the numbers, it's quite unprecedented, including from France. And at some point in one of your books, you write that no one is today capable of connecting the dots and seeing the whole picture, because the world is getting too complicated. And on the other hand, you underline that humanity always has this propension to invent stories and to live through stories. And you also think that we should be defiant of stories, because they can lead us to delusion. So how do you see in this context, how do you see your own books or your own work? Because you're also creating, you're also giving us a story, right, to connect the dots, from Sapiens to Deus, which is a rather linear story of the evolution of humanity, with a clear start 70,000 years ago, and it seems to be a clear end. Right? So are you not also, inventing a new story for humanity? How do you square that circle?
Well, I think that, yes, stories maybe are the source of our power as a species. We conquer the world, we dominate the world because we can cooperate in large numbers, and we can cooperate in large numbers because we can create stories in which many people believe. And as long as enough people believe in the same story, they can cooperate with strangers, they can follow the same rules, the same laws, and so forth. And this is not necessarily bad. Even if you look at something like the recent World Football Cup, which was quite a success for France, then to think about it that, you take people from France, Argentina, and Japan to Russia to play a game together. And what makes this possible is that they all believe in the same story of football, which is obvious, should be obvious to everybody, is our invention. You can argue about gods, about nations, but almost everybody will very quickly agree that football is our invention. We invented the rules. But as long as you have millions of people who all believe in the same rules, in the same story of football, what is it about? How do you win? What can you do? Then you can create this wonderful thing of really a global celebration of sports and achievements, and even if you have, national teams competing against each other, it all is founded on a basic agreement about the same rules, the same story. So I don't think that stories are necessarily bad. The problem begins when people forget that this is just a story that we created in order to enable ourselves to cooperate better, in order to improve our lives. And instead of the story serving us, what happens is that people begin to serve the story and may start to fight wars and kill millions for the sake of the story. So in football it happens on a small scale, when some football hooligans start maybe a fight against one another. But with other stories, it can escalate to entire wars. And so I think we can't understand the way we think as a species is through stories. So you have to create them, there is nothing wrong about them. But you always need to remember, this is just a story that we created for some purposes. It's not the ultimate reality. And all stories eventually are replaced by something else.
Right, but in your book you're also inventing a story, right, for humanity. You're giving a sort of direction where humanity is going. So is it not also quite theological what you're trying to do?
It's philosophical. I mean, theological, no, because there is no theos, there is no God, unless it is the gods that we are about to become.
Right.
but there is no God beyond the gods invented by humans.
Right, but it doesn't seem that there is a way back, for instance, in what you present. It seems to be there is a very clear direction of where history
Yes,
is going.
there is no going back. There is definitely no going back to the world of hunter-gatherers. There is definitely not going back to the world before industry. There is definitely, and this is perhaps most relevant to what's happening today, there is definitely no going back to the world before globalization. People can fantasize as much as they want about building walls and returning to some kind of world divided into nations. But as long as you have things like intercontinental ballistic missiles, and as long as you have things like climate change and like artificial intelligence, then the idea that you can retreat into some national fortress and just build high walls and raise the drawbridge, it won't work.
But let's come back to hunter-gatherers, if you don't mind. Because I found in many instances in your book some almost a nostalgia for hunter-gatherers. You're saying that they had superb mental abilities, better than us, better physical dexterity, that actually a Chinese peasant or a Manchester factory worker was much more unhappy and had a harder job than a hunter-gatherer who lived a rather pleasant life with a lot of leisure. And at some point you even say that the only human that really cannot be automated would be the hunter-gatherer, because his capacities are actually attached to all different parts of his environment, and he has no specialization. He's able to do a bit of everything. So he has this common sense that I cannot replicate yet. And it seems to me that we see that tendency in our society, I don't say to get back to hunter-gatherer, but for instance, in France, you have companies that propose sessions of hunting-gathering. So you go in the French Alps, it's called Jean des Bois, right? And you learn how to make a bow, how to make fire, how to live like a hunter-gatherer. I read recently an article that also hairy men were back in fashion. So hairy torsos, beards. And when I was in Israel, I met with a writer who had just written an article about digital cavemen and the tendency that we have to protect ourselves from technology by getting back to very sort of primitive habits. And you very, very often you underline that we still have a DNA that comes from very ancient times. So we still have this instinct in us. And as you say that Homo Deus, the ambition of Homo Deus is to be autonomous, right? To be a sort of autonomous individual. It seems to me that it's not like going for a circle, going back to the hunter-gatherer. What is a form of autonomy? Because he was able to survive for himself. He was able to do a bit of everything. There not this nostalgia for this world of pre-agricultural societies.
Well, there is definitely nostalgia, and for some good reasons, but it's mostly just play acting and fantasies, which can be nice, and certainly we can learn a lot from trying to live in the woods for 2 weeks as a hunter-gatherer. But it's not a practical idea to go back as a society, first of all, because 99% of people will starve to death. You can't feed 8 billion people from hunting and gathering. Before the agricultural revolution, the world population was about 8 million people. Secondly, even if you go to this trip in the Alps and for a couple of weeks you hunt and you gather, you know that if you fall down and break your leg, they'll take you to the hospital, I hope. You know that the other guys that are going over there, they won't murder you, because then they'll have to deal with the French police and with the French courts. They are still there. Maybe you don't see them immediately in the woods, but everybody knows in the back of their mind there is a police, there is a court system, there are prisons. And you can't escape that. Most people wouldn't like to give up the hospitals and the police and the courts and all that. So we have to, on the one hand, we need to appreciate what we have lost since the days of the hunter-gatherers. It would be a good idea to try and recapture some of the abilities, some of the attitudes. but we shouldn't delude ourselves and fall victim to some kind of nostalgic fantasy that, oh, we can just go back to live as hunter-gatherers in the woods. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, I get that, but I wanted to stress is that you are often presented as a techno-prophet, and what I see in your books is also something more anthropological, about form of human, at least not essence, but sort of primitive biological form that still determines the number of our actions.
Yeah, we are still basically the same animals that we were 20, 30, 40,000 years ago in the Stone Age. Our brains, our bodies are still the brains and bodies of hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
And many of the problems we encounter today, both as collectives and as individuals, result from this enormous gap, or enormous mismatch between the environment that our bodies and brains evolved in adaptation to, and the actual environment we live in, of these giant cities and computers and mobile phones and airplanes and all that. So we encounter this gap every day, and it creates enormous psychological and social problems.
Yeah. Now going more forward in the future, there is a theme in your books that I find very appealing, which is the unification of humanity. What you're saying is that, well, humanity was unified in the very first ages, and then sort of split, and that we're in the process of reunifying humanity through money, through religion, through empires in the first couple of millennia, and now through form of global governance that you think is needed. My first question is on that point. What do we lose in the process? And by that I mean, I was reminded of this quote from Lévi-Strauss in Christotropics, Tropics, I suppose, where he comes to Brazil and he sees that primitive communities are being destroyed, basically, and that everything got uniformized. And he thinks, well, is humanity about to produce mass civilization as we produce beetroots? And so are we to become beetroots, right? In a unified humanity where you land everywhere in the world and we speak the same language, which is English, and we have the same habits. We all, as you say, we all dress Europeans. When you go to China, they dress like we dress in Paris. That is a difference. So as an historian, do you see that we are losing something in the, seems to me, the cultures that are disappearing in this process?
Yes, certainly. I mean, the process of globalization and the creation of a global culture, and even if not all people speak English, there is a far more powerful language that dominates the world today, which is not Chinese and it's not Arabic, it's mathematics. The entire world, you can go anywhere you like. The really dominant language today in the world is mathematics. All the important organizations, whether it's government or business or even education, the real language they speak is the language of mathematics. You want to really have an impact in some field, and you have some vision, some idea, in the end you will need to somehow translate it into the language of mathematics that organizations and computers can understand and analyze and gather data and have statistics and all that. And certainly if you look at how people dress and what people eat, so this process of globalization and creating a global culture is going on very rapidly. There are advantages, there are disadvantages, like for every historical development. We need to be aware of the downside, of the damages, and try to limit them. But for very practical purposes, I think that in the 21st century, humankind will simply not survive unless it manages, to some extent, to create and maintain a global culture and strong global cooperation. It doesn't mean a global government or a global empire. It doesn't mean abolishing all cultural differences and so that everybody in the world will look the same and dress the same and eat the same. But it does mean that we need a significant amount of trust And you can't have strong trust unless you have some common cultural traditions. And again, a common cultural tradition can be something like the World Football Cup, which people in Argentina and Japan and France watch together.
But then that leads to the question, because you're saying there shouldn't be a world government, right? There shouldn't be a state. But that still opens the question of the situation of the global governance today, because clearly the UN is not fulfilling its mission. When I was on this trip on AI, I met with people who were supposed to be responsible for AI in the United Nations. And they said, well, we created digital blue helmets. I said, oh, fantastic, where are they? Oh, just in this corridor, there are 5 of them. And yeah, Microsoft, just next door, there are 2,000 computer scientists. And so the UN is now begging private companies to get some information on data, but clearly, for instance, the AI is not on the agenda of the UN. And they cannot even discuss that with their member states. It's not what the UN has been built for. So you can see that the international multilateral structures that we put in place after the Second World War have been made totally obsolete, and that they're not gaining traction or power, they're losing traction and power. So my question is, to be more concrete, if we are a more unified humanity, what sort of global governance can we put in place? Is it classical multilateralism when states and governments are meeting in some assembly to decide big issues? Or is it something more subtle, right? With light governance framework where civil society organizations are involved, where, what concretely, where do we meet? Because it doesn't happen today, and it seems to me more the contrary that's taking place.
Yeah, I mean, historically there are 2 models for how such a thing can happen. It can come through imperial conquest, when you have one dominant player that gathers enough power to simply dominate in one way or the other. More and more territory and people, and impose something from above. Or it can happen through a more peaceful spread of common values, common norms, and common culture, which then serves as a basis for cooperation and trust, even without the imposition of some imperial conqueror. And of course you have the third option, which nothing works, and you just don't have cooperation. And in the past, that meant a period, say, of a lot of war and conflict. But in the 21st century, it could mean the end of human civilization, because of the kind of problems that we are now facing, whether it's with climate change or whether it's with the rise of new disruptive technologies. The fact that we are now living in a global world, in an increasingly global civilization, certainly doesn't mean that there are no conflicts. Every civilization is usually characterized by a high level of internal conflict. We need to differentiate between what people talk about as a clash of civilization and most of the wars and revolutions in history, they are not between civilizations. They are internal affairs. If you look, say, if you talk about European civilization, Europeans fought each other far, far more and more often than they fought any other civilization. And even on the personal level, the people we fight most often are our own family members, and not strangers that we don't know. So just to say that now the entire world is actually one civilization is something very different from saying that there is harmony in the world.
I understand that, and I appreciate the point on the global culture that has been forged. But I'd like to, I insist on the question of concrete structures of governance. Because if we need to decide things on climate change, if we want to put, for instance, a carbon tax, which is something which is quite popular among economists, as a more consensual, that you should internalize the cost of the carbon in some form of pricing. Yeah. I don't know what you think of that, I'm not sure you've written about that, but if we were to put such a thing in place, then you need an administration, you need a police, you need a court system. And for the moment we have none of that. And the only little things that we had, which was the WTO, where there is this arbitration court, where actually nations do respect their rulings, because trade is so important to them. is being threatened by the Trump administration, who refuses to appoint a judge on this specific court. So where do we, what sort of institutions do we build to create that? Because if we are to survive, if the dangers are so imminent, then we need to hurry up. Is it through the UN? Is it through whatever forum?
Well, from a practical perspective, global governance is unrealistic for the coming decades. So it's just not realistic. At present, it seems that the only realistic option is to have a strong pressure from within nations, from within countries, that makes global issues the central consideration in national politics. That when the election next come along, and you consider which party or which candidate I should vote for, then you take into consideration global issues. Like you have a debate on television between the prospective candidates. So the main questions being asked, or some of the main questions being asked, is if we vote for you, how will you deal with the threat of climate change? If we vote for you, how will you deal with regulation of artificial intelligence? And again, this is not far-fetched. At present, it's definitely not going in this direction. But it can. I mean, if you think about what kind of questions people choose politicians according to, then they can vary enormously. It doesn't necessarily have to be about local material issues. Very often, ideological issues. In the United States, for example, things like abortion or like gay marriage, they can become a very central issue, even though they don't really affect the economic situation. So if this can become a major political consideration in national politics, then it's not impossible that also global issues, like a global agreement on AI, or a global agreement on climate change, will be the same. Again, it's not happening right now.
Yeah, you have to watch a French presidential debate, right? And they're not even speaking about Europe. That's already too far.
No, but this is where culture can make a difference. Because how people judge potential candidates, there is nothing deterministic about it. It can be even about completely fictional things, like all kinds of religious issues. It can become very central. So here, whereas, again, real global government, I think, is unrealistic and counterproductive in the coming decades. But to turn national politics, or to make global issues most central in national politics, this is certainly possible because, again, one thing that we should realize, there are many people today, especially political leaders, that try to create this dichotomy between nationalism and globalism. You have to choose. Are you a nationalist, a patriot, or are you a globalist? And the thing to realize is there is no real contradiction. I think that today, to be a good patriot means to be a globalist. But if to be a patriot means to care about the safety and prosperity of people in your country, of your compatriots, the only way to do it effectively is through global cooperation. You won't be able to protect your compatriots from climate change or from the automation revolution unless you think on a global level. So I think that global issues can become central issues in national politics.
But at the same time, aren't you saying that those technologies also lead to some form of de-globalization? That what we're seeing with the rise of AI is a number of superpowers appearing and other countries falling almost into oblivion, right, or into irrelevance. And so, when we're speaking about globalization, we're still in this sort of industrial, intellectual framework where globalization spreads everywhere and countries get more equal through the process. And it seems now that this is reversing, right? That globalization actually increases inequalities between nations. So isn't that going in the other direction?
Yeah, and this itself is a global issue. I mean, one of the things and again, it is very central, it should be very clear, is the automation revolution, the rise of AI, will have very different impact on different countries. Some countries, especially China and the US, will benefit enormously. But other countries might completely collapse, especially their economy. You are right that in the last century or two, the process of industrialization and globalization created a global trade network in which every country had a place, like links in a chain. And a lot of developing countries made progress by basically selling their cheap labor to produce products for the developed countries. And the automation revolution will hit that. It will hit the weakest links in the global trade network the worst. Because one of the things it will do, it will make cheap labor, unskilled labor, completely irrelevant.
And also you need to have a supply chain at home.
Yeah, and for example, instead of producing this shirt, this suit in Bangladesh or Vietnam or Honduras, and then shipping it all the way to Europe, you can produce it in Europe, because if the robots and 3D printers are doing it, why have the robots in Bangladesh when you can have the robots in France or Germany? And why pay for truck drivers and sailors to take it all the way from Bangladesh to Paris? You can just print it or produce it here. Now, this could be very good news for France or Germany, or at least for China and the US, which are now leading this. But this is terrible news for Honduras and Bangladesh. And so we might see kind of globalization in reverse, that some countries that lead the revolution become ever more rich and powerful, and other countries are left completely behind with no way to progress, because they have nothing. Their cheap labor doesn't count for anything. There are new jobs, let's say in engineering software, of all these robots and 3D printers, but these countries don't have the human capital, and they can't retrain textile workers in Bangladesh to be software engineers. And I guess that the Americans will not be very happy to suddenly have millions of immigrants from Honduras and Bangladesh coming and say, hey, we want to work in Silicon Valley. At least not as it seems now. So where will Bangladesh be in 30 years? And this is something we need to worry about now, because in 30 years it will be too late.
So this is more fragmentation, right?
Yeah, this is, I mean, I get a lot of questions about, like, what should we teach children today? And one of the things one of the dangerous scenarios is that there is no common, like, idea of education of children. It depends where you live. If you live in one part of the world, maybe you need to teach your kids how to engineer software. If you live in another part of the world, maybe the best thing is to teach them how to shoot a Kalashnikov, because this is what they'll need in 20 or 30 years. Unless we take action today to prevent this kind of divergence in the human future.
I met with an economist in China, and he told me we're going to win that AI revolution because we have the supply chain already at home, and that we can tailor the product according to the needs of the consumer very quickly. That now you cannot afford to wait for 2 months, as you said, for the shipment to come, because the taste of the consumers has already changed. And so in that world of immediacy, you need the supply chain just where you are. And they already have that, right? Now maybe turning to different topics, the topic that I was mentioning in the introduction. Because I think it's not only a personal obsession, it's also something that you mentioned quite often in your book, which is liberalism. And so it's a think tank I run here in Paris, Génération Libre. We are very strong on trying to promote liberalism in a country where I think that really embraced the neoliberal revolution of the 80s. But more fundamentally, it seems to me that first of all, that you have some form of sympathy for classical liberalism, right? I mean, you write that money is the apogee of human tolerance. And at some point in your book, you also remind the reader that Reagan and Thatcher were not only champions of economic freedom, but also of individual liberty. That was going hand in hand, like market and democracy. That was at least the aspiration. And that the whole idea of that system was to really empower individuals and to allow individuals to go beyond biological, economic, and social constraints and to construct their own personality and to be as diverse as possible, which is something that looks quite nice. First question on that is, first of all, you see that process as somehow, for today, and regardless of the AI revolution that we will mention later, you see that as rather victorious. You think that liberalism has won, basically, and that even, it's quite funny when you say that even Occupy Wall Street activists, they somehow embrace liberalism because they're activists in the name of freer markets of human rights. And so in your view, that your Fukuyama prediction, in a way, has become a reality, and where God is dead and nationalism is losing ground. It's not an obvious statement to make, especially like here in France, where you see a revival of religious movements, where obviously nationalism is now spreading not only on the right but also on the left, which is something that didn't happen before. So those movements that we see, are you confident this is the swan song of religious communities and national attachments? Or do you think there is a possibility to reverse that movement of liberal progress?
Well, there is nothing deterministic or linear about the way that history moves, and we cannot be sure almost about anything in this respect of where the world will be in 10 years or 20 years. What we can say regarding the rise of liberalism is a couple of things. First of all, despite the recent resurgence of nationalism and religion and so forth, if you look at the right-wing parties today, whether in Europe or whether in the United States, if you think 50 years ago or 100 years ago, they would be considered like extreme, radical, liberal hippies, tree-hugging, whatever. The types of things that they take for granted, like voting rights for women, or that they can argue about gay marriage, but you don't put these people in jail or kill them. You don't put Jews in concentration camps and gas them. So you don't want immigrants, but you still don't hear about, okay, let's gas them. Even a lot of there are some extremists, of course, but you take the average Republican today in the US and transport him or her a century ago, they would be on the extreme, on the radical liberal wing. And to take another example with regard to the rise of nationalism, at least as things are now, I don't know about 5 years from now, but like the recent commemoration of the end of the First World War should kind of remind us of the long road that we have already covered with regard to the nationalist demons. I mean, you do see now a resurgence of nationalism in Europe, but it is still joyfully nothing like what it was a century ago. If you look at...
You would disagree with our president who recently said that the situation was comparable with the 1930s.
It's still very different, mercifully. Again, I don't know what will be in 5 years, but if you think about, say, the rise of the populist right in Italy or in Hungary. So far, I mean, a century ago in the First World War, Italy entered the First World War in 1915 in order to conquer two rather small territories, the city of Trieste and the area of Trento, which were then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And about 500,000 Italians were killed in the war. About 1 million Italian soldiers were wounded in a terrible, terrible conflict that lasted for 3 years. Now, how many supporters of the Italian League today, of Salviano, would be willing to go to war against Slovenia and pay not 500,000 dead, 50,000 dead, 5,000 dead to capture, say, Fayuma, or what was Fayuma, from the Slovenians? How many would volunteer to the army to actually die in the trenches in the way that millions of Italians volunteered a century ago? I think very few.
Right.
Again, if you look at Viktor Orban, so far, I don't know 5 years from now, but so far you don't hear Viktor Orban saying something like, well, you know, the evil Romanians are holding the sacred Hungarian ancestral lands in Transylvania and the Banat, and we need to go to war.
It's not very far from that, because it's giving passports to the Hungarians living in that part of Romania in order to try to regain at least influence.
Yes, I mean, again, there are dangerous developments, but part of, I think part of the problem is that people just don't realize how deep the precipice is, how deep the chasm is. They think, oh, we've already fallen. We haven't fallen yet. We are still on the edge. We can fall in 2 years, in 5 years. And people just don't realize how deep it is, because they think now is as bad as it can get. It's as bad as in the 1930s. It isn't. So you can look at it optimistically or pessimistically.
Right. And
optimistically is that we are still in a relatively good situation.
And on religions, because on religions, for instance, people are willing to kill for their ideas, still today. Right?
Yes.
So how would you argue the same?
Less so in
to
Europe.
put it into perspective and so on.
Less so in Europe than in other parts of the world. There are certainly many dangerous developments in this respect. And I would say, and going back to your question about liberalism, what we see now is really a crisis of vision, a crisis of a story that 20 years ago, in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, there was a clear, maybe a false, but a clear vision for the future of humankind, which was the liberal globalist vision that the world is going to liberalize, to globalize, and this will bring prosperity and freedom to more and more people over time. And this was a vision in which people strongly believed, certainly in Europe and North America, but also in more and more countries around the world. In Brazil, in India, even in China and Russia. And what happened over the last 10, 15 years is that this vision collapsed. And not only people in Brazil and India are increasingly losing faith in it, but even in the core liberal democracies of Western Europe and North America. And into this, and we can discuss what caused the story, the vision to collapse. But the fact is that it is collapsing. And this creates a vacuum. And what really shapes people's emotional situation is almost never the present condition. It's the way they view the future. And if they have no vision for the future, even if the situation is still relatively okay in many respects, they tend to become very disoriented and frightened. And because nobody is able to provide a meaningful vision for the future, this vacuum is being filled with nostalgic fantasies about the past, like the fantasies of nationalism and of religion.
But you also have a deeper analysis, I think, of the crisis of liberalism. Because what you're saying is not only that we lack a story, but it's also that fundamentally science and technology has changed the way that we view the individual as an autonomous human being. So I think you would agree with the idea that our liberal societies are grounded on the facts that we can all make autonomous decisions, that we have some form of free will, and we'll discuss that again. And so we can participate in the market, we can be liable for, like legally speaking, for the decisions we make, we can cast a vote and so on. And that's fundamentally anchored in the idea that the individual is basically free to choose and then responsible for his own action. And then what you're saying is that there are two things that are questioning that very basic ideas. First of all, neurosciences, which show, and I'll get back to that afterwards, but we show more or less that we sort of prove the deterministic point, that we react to biochemical signals, and that our free will is mainly a illusion. And secondly, and quite coupled with that, but not inherent to that, is the rise of AI technology, which tend to manipulate our behavior and to put us into certain lanes. So we have less and less practical ability to make a choice, and we lose the agency muscle. Like we don't take a map when we drive a car. When I went to China, I met with Didi, which is the local Uber, and there, not only as a driver, you follow the itinerary that has been proposed on the screen, but also you are assigned a certain client because they go from the market-based, incentive-based system to a dispatch system, and they say, well, with the AI, we know better. We know exactly what the situation of the traffic in Beijing will be in 4 minutes. So we know it's better if you go and take that client. It's going to be better for everybody. You can earn more money, the client will be more happy. So what would we let you the choice? So you abolish the idea of a market, basically, and you sort the imbalance between supply and demand through dispatch and through a centralized system. And then they even want to equip their drivers with sensors to monitor their level of stress, to monitor when they're hungry and when they're thirsty. And so they can say, okay, given that you will have to go to the toilets in half an hour, then I'll give you that client, and there is a public toilet just here, and so we optimize the whole system, and it's going to be better for you. But at the end of the day, the driver is just some human flesh and neurons, and he's just following directions for his better sake. Right? So it's very tempting, it's very attractive. And so what you're saying is that those two components are depriving us of the ideal of an autonomous individual. Well, can you dwell on that? And then I'd like to question a few points.
Yes, I mean, I think that the really big revolution is what you're talking about, the kind of merger of biotech and infotech, of biology and computer science. And this is the greatest revolution that is now happening in the world, and doesn't receive nearly as much attention as it should from the public and from the political system. And, you know, questioning free will and human autonomy is not new. It has been done for thousands and thousands of years. Yeah. What is new is now you have the technology to actually implement it, like with this wonderful example of the drivers of Didi, which ultimately, I mean, the ultimate vision of Didi and Uber is to get rid of the humans altogether. I mean, if we can have this service without the human driver, it will be even more efficient and certainly far more lucrative to the corporation. They don't have to pay salaries to anybody. And this is the direction in which we are going. And we can get into the philosophical discussion about free will, and I think it is worthwhile, and it is interesting. But as a starting point, what should be very clear is that even for the people who believe in some potential for free will, it should be very obvious that the vast majority of decisions that the vast majority of people make on a daily basis do not come even close to this philosophical idea of free will. And we have an enormous wealth of research now from the life sciences, from psychologists, sociologists, brain scientists. We increasingly understand how people make decisions in real life, which means we can increasingly predict it, and we can increasingly manipulate it. Now, it's very hard for people to accept it, because there is a huge confusion between will and free will. When you come to a person and say, most of your decisions are not the result of your free will, they are incredulous and often even angry. What do you mean? I'm doing it because I want to do it. Nobody's forcing me to do it. But this is really a confusion between, yes, you have a will, you have desires. Nobody is saying you don't have desires. It's the most obvious thing in the world that humans have desires. I drink this because I want to drink it. The question of free will is not whether you have desires, but where do these desires come from? Did you choose to have this desire now? Or is this desire the outcome of a mind-boggling network of biochemical and social and cultural forces that you did not choose and you are not even aware of? And this is the real question, and the answer, at least for most scientists, is very obvious. The vast majority of decisions, including decisions whom to vote for on election day, and whom to date, and which car to buy, they are not the result of free will.
I'd like to take first your theoretical point, the one you just made on free will. I'm not sure that there is such a consensus, even in the neuroscience community. First of all, because the neuroscientists are the first to recognize that we know very little about how the brain works as we speak today. And secondly, because you also have a number of experiments who tend to show that, yes, obviously we react to biochemical signals, that's how we can live and survive. But we also develop some mechanisms, some agencies of mechanisms of decision making that we can even trace in the brain. And if you take, when you're mentioning Daniel Kahneman, because there is this cluster of intellectuals like Kahneman and behavioral economists and so on, who, starting from the fact that we don't have free will, that we are determined, then that leads to the very dangerous policy of nudging people, right, for their own good, which I find is quite, it's a big step to make. And even if you read Kahneman, he speaks of the system 1, which is indeed determined and subconscious, but he also speaks of the system 2, right, that can regain control, where actually you can build up rationality, where possibly you could say even education or policy making and so on should give you the means and the tools to take back control on your own will. And I think it's theoretical, but it's a rather important point, because if you're saying, okay, it's a scientific consensus, we don't have free will, then in a way you surrender to AI systems and you say, well, since we don't, then we'd better give up and accept the convenience that they give us. And if on the contrary, you assume that there is still something to be explored in our decision-making systems, then you would do exactly the opposite. You would confront AI systems and say, hold on, we are giving way too much power to them, and we should try to find ways and means to take control.
Yeah, so this is why I said that the vast majority of decisions, of the vast majority of people, including scientists, including historians, including Nobel Prize winners, in order not to get too much bogged down in the deep philosophical discussion, we can concede that maybe there is some ideal of freedom, that with a lot of hard work on yourself and a lot of meditation and philosophy and self-training and whatever, you can reach a point, but this is not the point. This is not what is happening in the vast majority of cases when people make decisions. This is why I made a slightly weaker argument. Not that there is no possibility of freedom. It's just that in most cases, this is not what is happening when people make choices, including the most important choices of their lives. And that also, coming back to Kahneman, that the people are lazy. Yeah. That it takes a lot, the two problems I see with the ideal of free will is first, or at least the formulation of how people talk about it, is first that they tend to assume that freedom is something we have and not something we need to struggle for and develop. That any decision I make, this is my free will. So this is very dangerous. You don't have free, maybe you can develop it, maybe you can struggle for it, but you don't have it. This is not the starting point. This might be the ending point. And secondly, that the other related danger is that if you are under the impression that I have free will, any decision I make, this is my free will, then it makes you very incurious about yourself. You don't need to make the effort to understand what is actually happening in my mind. Where is this desire coming from? Who am I? Because if you simply believe that any decision you make is a reflection of your free will, then you think you know yourself perfectly, and there is no incentive to start this difficult process of self-exploration and so forth. The other problem is that you are not only less curious about yourself, you are also far more open to manipulations. The easiest people to manipulate are the people who believe in free will. Because whatever you manipulate them into doing, they are convinced, I'm doing it because this is my free will. It's impossible that somebody has manipulated me to vote for this politician or to buy this product or whatever. So this is why I tend to, again, I can grant that maybe there is an ideal of freedom that we can develop somehow, but this should not be the starting point of the discussion.
And yes, I understand better. At some point you're mentioning the liberal phoenix, saying liberalism can rise from its ashes and take a new form. And indeed, in the history of that doctrine, there has been many moments where it was challenged, like after the crisis of 1929, where laissez-faire was getting really out of fashion because of disaster it had led to, and then a group of liberal thinkers in the end of the 30s assembled in the Lippmann Conference, Burinov, and they came up with the idea of antitrust policy. In fact, that state some legitimacy to a number of areas, and they actually gave rise to the Montpellier Society after the war, and even to the founding of the European Union. So the ideas are so powerful. So what sort of revival do you see of that doctrine? You know, what's the phoenix that look like?
Even in the future?
Yeah.
That's I don't know.
What's your intellectual aspiration?
Well, what I can say about liberalism, in its more general meaning, not just the narrow economic sense,
Sure.
but in the general meaning of liberal democracy and its attendant values, is that it is the most adaptable of all modern ideologies, or perhaps of any ideology that humans ever evolved. This is its main advantage over its rivals, whether it's traditional religions, or whether it's fascism, or whether it's communism. The really big advantage of liberal democracy is it is far less dogmatic, and therefore far more adaptable, which is why it has managed to survive and actually flourish through a series of crises. And again, if you look at the last century, then the crisis we experience today is still less severe than the crisis that liberal democracy has experienced and managed to overcome in the 20th century. If we look at the first big crisis was the First World War, that again, all these expectations of free trade and globalization and liberalization, they were there before 1914. And then you had this imperial clash of the First World War. Then you had a second crisis in the 1930s and 40s with the rise of fascism, and again with the rise of communism after the Second World War in the 1960s, in the 1970s. In all of these points, if you think about 1916, if you think about 1939, if you think about 1968, at all of these points, it seemed that liberal democracy is a thing of the past. It's over. It was a complete illusion. It can't work. The future belongs to fascism. The future belongs to communism. The future belongs to something else. And in all these cases, eventually liberal democracy managed to recuperate, to take even some of the ideas of its rivals, and to come up in a new form, and a better form, and a stronger form. And the crisis we have today, it's severe, but less so. Still, I don't know in 5 years, but the situation in 2018 is still far better than in 1938 or in 1968. Whether it can again revive, I don't know. What new form it will take, again, I don't know. This is for the future. But I think it has a good chance of reviving again.
I would like to switch a bit and to discuss suffering. Because it seems to me that many of your books, you dismiss the idea of, you dismiss human rights as a fiction, a theological fiction that comes from the idea of a human essence, that itself comes from a certain belief in God. And so it seems to me that on one hand you are sort of downgrading humans, on the other you are upgrading animals, because first of all you believe that we probably made animals suffer way too much in our 3 waves of extinction that we provoked. And it seems to me that your criteria to judge societies is not really about, do they protect rights, individual rights, because these are fantasies, but more about, do people suffer, or even is there suffering, whether it's with humans or with animals or any other form that we don't know of that could suffer. So is that, in a way, the ultimate criteria, right, to live in in the world you aspire to, right, to limit suffering? And does that prevail, in a way, over what you would call the ideology of human rights? And then I would like to ask, what sort of practical consequences does it have? Because obviously, if you don't believe in human rights, you clearly don't believe in a democratic vote, for instance. So, what sort of system do you build on that idea of limiting suffering?
Well, it's an exaggeration to say I don't believe in human rights. I believe that human rights are a human construct and not a kind of absolute reality out there. And in this sense, it doesn't mean we need to give them up or we need to disregard them. Human rights are a social construct like corporations, like money, like the laws of football. And they can be extremely useful in a particular political context that if you have good reasons that you define. It's very difficult all the time to try and see who is suffering for what. But with experience, you can, for example, establish that in a particular state of economic and development and technological development, a free press is an important safeguard to protect humans from unnecessary suffering. So once you establish that, you can talk about the freedom of the press or as a value, an important value, and to examine different countries and rank them according to how free the press is. And you don't need every time again to explain the connection between free press and protecting humans from injustice and from suffering and from misery. It would be impossible. Just as like we decided on currencies like the euro or like the dollar, and every time I go to the supermarket, I don't need to start convincing the cashier at the supermarket, look, this piece of paper, there is somebody in the Federal Reserve, and no, he knows what money is. We can understand each other. So in this sense, human rights are an extremely important and positive social construct that we have constructed quite recently, only in the last 2-3 centuries. It's important still to realize it because it means that it makes very little sense to say judge ancient societies according to the defense of human rights, because human rights don't mean much in a hunter-gatherer society or in an ancient agricultural society. It also means, and this is far more controversial and problematic, but maybe far more to the point, like your issue of voting rights. I think it is a mistake, a historical mistake, to kind of sacralize voting rights, that in any historical situation whatsoever, it is a top value that all humans will have voting rights and this will be the same. In many cases, it doesn't work. You need, for a functioning electoral democracy, you need all kinds of preconditions. If these preconditions are not there, it won't work. Just say invading a country and establishing, importing this system. Okay, once we manage to have an election, then everything will be perfect. It doesn't work. In some cases it can, but it needs preconditions. And part of the danger of kind of, reifying human rights, forgetting that they are just a social construct, is that you forget the historical context. And you think that in any situation whatsoever, in any country in the world, irrespective of the situation of the economy, of literacy, of communication, of security, we should just go there and create an electoral system, and this is essential.
No, I get that, but I think you are going a bit further sometimes. You're saying that the ideas of Jefferson and Locke, who underpin all our social systems, are clearly outdated and obsolete because they rely on this too strong a belief in sort of as an essential human right. And so you're saying we need to replace the basis.
It depends on the context. In some contexts, they work well, and they protect humans and maybe other animals from suffering. But if you forget that they are just our social constructs, and you take them to be some ultimate reality, then you lose the context. And then there are many political mistakes that, that you can make. To take another example, again, a controversial and very problematic issue that I think should be talked about and should be clear. Democracy can only function effectively if you have enough consensus in society. Democracy is really a system for resolving disagreements between people who already agree on the basics. If you have a group of people who agree on the basics, the most important values, the most important interests, then democracy can work between them. If they have some disagreement, they can vote and everybody accepts the result of the vote. But if you have a society or a situation in which people don't agree on the most basic things, democracy won't work there because the losing side will have no real reason to accept the verdict, because what do I care what other people who don't share my basic interests and values think? They don't really care about me. To take an extreme example, but I think it's very clear, if somebody comes and says, well, look, let's resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict just democratically by having everybody vote. Let's take the 100 million people in the Arab countries and the 6 million, 7 million Jews in Israel. Everybody votes, and whatever they decide, this is the democratic resolution. It won't work. Israelis will not feel obliged by the result, because what do we care about the votes of people who hate us and don't care about us? And it's the same in situation when countries age towards civil war, whether it's Spain in 1936 or in many other cases, that once there is no longer an agreement on the basics, the actual voting doesn't mean much. And if you look, for example, when I look today at a place like the United States, my biggest fear for the US and for the world, because the US is still the world leader, is that they are getting dangerously close to that point, when the divisions are so deep, the disagreements are so deep, that the process of voting just loses its meaning, because you reach a point when the losers say, but we don't care.
But I don't think it also goes hand in hand with the disintegration of the nation state, that we are, the disintegration of the nation states that we are witnessing even in Western Europe. You know? We don't see that we all belong to a nation as we used to. And so that saps those basic tenets that you are mentioning.
Exactly. I mean, most of the successful democracies were established in, there are exceptions, but in most cases they were established in existing nation states.
Yeah.
So this basic precondition of everybody sharing some bedrock of values and interests, it was there. And then what happens that when you think, oh, okay, so this is a basic human right to vote, and we need now to impose it or to import it to every other place in the world. And then you try to import it to a place where there isn't this strong national sentiment or this basic agreement, and it doesn't work. And you say, but why doesn't it work? It doesn't work because it's a precondition.
No, I get that. But then it's quite alarming for the state of our democracies today, right? Because
very alarming.
Right? Okay, so that leads me to the next part, which is what we're going to do. So I think you mentioned quite quite clearly all the threats that we are facing and the new world into which we are entering. Now, when on your very last book, 21st Lesson, when you finish the book, you say, well, if I caricature, you say, well, we have to accept that we have no free will, that personality is something that is also made up. So in order to find our inner self, we need to, well, at least it's your option to meditate and to go into Buddhist practice, which you do frequently, so that we can overcome all our determinations, all our desires, and find something more substantial. And it's all good at a personal level, maybe at a moral level. But then we also need to reflect on some policy solutions. And so I'd like to, if you don't, invite you to comment on the.
I'll just comment on that. The last chapter, and I tried to write it. That it's a personal chapter. People ask me, okay, so how do you manage? And I talk about myself. I certainly don't think that this is the solution for everybody. I certainly don't think that this is a solution to political problems. I think that for political problems, the most important thing is to organize. If you care about something, then yes, getting to know yourself better and getting to know your own weaknesses and so forth is important also politically, because then you can act in the world and you can organize with other people far more effectively, but eventually you need to reach the level of cooperation and organization. 50 people who cooperate effectively in an organization are far more effective than 500 individual activists, each doing their own thing. So I think organizations are extremely important in this respect. And if there is something that you care about deeply, I would say maybe the first step is either join an organization or create an organization, because individual activism is very, very weak.
It's Tocqueville's response to the crisis of individualism, form associations. So there are three policies that I would like to discuss with you because you allude to them in your book. There is universal basic income. There is the question of data ownership, who owns the data, and you're saying it's maybe the biggest political question at the moment. And then there is education. So just to take them in turn, on universal basic income, which is now, at least it's an idea that it's now widespread. I think everybody in this room has heard of universal basic income. It's an idea which is very ancient, it's like 2 centuries ago. But it's now at the forefront of the political debate. Hillary Clinton, in her book on the campaign, mentioned that she hesitated to put it explicitly as a policy that she wanted to pursue, and that she regretted not to have done so. So it's clearly something that mainstream politicians are now envisaging. Even the IMF, I think, published a report on basic income last year. But then my main question is, what's the main reason to implement or to try to carry out that policy? Is it, and it seems to me that you're saying it's because of the end of work, that people will be displaced because technology will replace a number of them. So we'll have to somehow find a way to feed them and survive. And it seems to me it's the narrative of the Silicon Valley, and it's why the Silicon Valley is so big on basic income. And as a result, very consistently you're saying, well, since it comes from the end of work, sort of worry, then this universal basic income also has to be global. And so Silicon Valley tycoons may well have to pay for the livelihoods of French workers who have been made redundant. And I'm not discussing here the practicalities of putting that in place, but just from the more theoretical perspective, I would myself argue that you have another way to promote the basic income and to say, well, work is transforming, but clearly there is still a Schumpeterian process taking place. We don't know which jobs will be created, but we already know that, for instance, in the countries that are most automated, such as Germany or South Korea, that's where unemployment rate is at the lowest. So you create new forms of jobs that you cannot anticipate, and because we cannot anticipate, then we're stuck in this idea that they disappear forever, but in fact create other things. Like when I was in DC, the French ambassador mentioned to me that truck drivers would disappear in the United States because they would be replaced by autonomous trucks. And so I went to see the truck drivers association. I said, what do you think about that? And they said, well, it's not such a big problem, because in fact, maybe you won't need a driver all through the interstate, but you will need a pilot to take it to the interstate, a pilot to take it out of the interstate, somebody to review the whole process, somebody to maybe drive the truck when it crosses school areas and so on. So in fact, you get 4 jobs instead of 1, even if they are different jobs requiring different sort of skills. And so my point is, in a way, this problem of basic income, like the structure of the basic income, depends on what's your starting point. If your starting point is end of work, then the result is global basic income, which is quite hard to do. If your starting point is, as I would argue, individual freedom, you need to give people enough to make their own choices willingly. Then you're much more comfortable into implementing a basic income on a national level in a given society, right? And which also will be more practical. So what do you make of that distinction?
Well, certainly there will be new jobs, but the question is whether enough new jobs and whether people will be able to retrain in time for the new jobs. And here the pressure, the psychological pressures could be far harsher than even the economic pressures, because to reinvent yourself again and again at age 30, at age 40, at age 50, to constantly change professions as the AI revolution intensifies, this is going to be very, very difficult. Now, it is the countries that lead the AI revolution will indeed benefit the most. And they will have even more jobs, both in designing the robots and computers and also in service industry, because they could pay for nurses, for yoga teachers that will take care, like every engineer will have 10 people serving his or her needs. So there will be more jobs in the developed leaders of the AI revolution. The real problem will not be there. It will be in the countries left behind, which will lose their manufacturing basis, which will not benefit so much from the new service jobs unless they can immigrate. I mean, if you have a lot of engineers in California that earns millions, so each of them want a private yoga teacher and a private trainer and a private this and a private that, but people from Honduras need to enjoy these jobs. They need to come to California. It's very difficult to nurse somebody if you don't live in the same country. And then you have the whole question of immigration. Will you allow 10 Hondurans to come to the United States for each engineer for that? If not, then even if you will have huge unemployment, huge demand for laborers in the US, which is not met, and huge unemployment in Honduras at the same time, unless you allow immigrants in, which is not very likely at the present moment. So the big problem is not in California, it's in Honduras. And then the question for UBI, when you say UBI, is it universal or is it national? Yeah. If it's taking money from California to pay people in Pennsylvania, that's okay. But the real question, will you take money from California to pay people in Honduras? Yeah. The other problem with the UBI scheme is the second word, universal basic income. Yeah. What is basic? The definition of basic is cultural. Biologically speaking, if you give somebody 3,000 calories a day, that's enough. But most people, let's say in France, would say that no, education is also basic. Yes, healthcare is basic. So education, what is basic education? Is it just 6 years? Is it 12 years? Is it everything up to PhD? Does it include playing the violin? There are lots and lots of questions. So does universal basic income means that everybody gets to go up to PhD and playing the violin, or just basic literacy? And the critical point here is this decision is extremely crucial, because whatever you define as basic, everybody gets, and whatever is not basic, nobody gets except the elite, because nobody has any other way of achieving it. If you say, okay, literacy is basic, but playing the violin isn't, then everybody gets to read and write, but almost nobody can play the violin because they don't work. They can't say, oh, but I want to pay. You can't pay, you don't have anything. So whatever you decide is basic, you can't go beyond that for most of the population.
Right, but there's a difference between providing the UBI as a service and providing the UBI as an income. And the idea of providing the UBI as an income is that then you make your own arbitrage, right? Maybe you want to play the violin and live in the countryside. And then you make that sacrifice in order to play the violin. So that's how it helps people making their own free choices, coming back to the free will.
Yeah, but then it goes to the question of, okay, so you say, I won't provide services, free service. I'll provide just, you get $10,000 or $50,000 or whatever. But then the question, what is the sum? And how did they reach the conclusion that $20,000 is enough? Did the committee, which decide on what is basic, include the violin in their calculation or not?
This is the point.
And there are much bigger things than playing the violin. If you go from education to healthcare, then consider, say, 50 years in the future, when you can get extremely expensive treatments that extend your life to 150. Or you can design your babies with genetic engineering, but it costs a lot of money. Now, is this basic? Or is it just only the elite gets to live forever and design their babies? The normal humans, they don't get this, it's not basic.
Right, but then I would argue that the price of something in a free market is how much you have to pay to deprive the other persons of the use of that good. So that's why if you give the same amount to everybody, that's fair. Because then what you take for instance, when you take the violin lesson, what you pay is the price for the others not to take the violin lesson. And same goes for when you buy a box of cereals. Right? They won't have the box of cereals. That's how you adjust the prices. And so in a way, it's fair because with that same amount, everybody will be deprived of the same number of goods.
But if the good is living another 50 years or having a super baby, then that's a completely different discussion, especially if, again, nobody knows, but if the technological reality is such that you cannot provide, this is at least in initial stages, these biotechnologies are so expensive, there is no way you can provide them to 8 billion people. So, do you ban it completely so nobody gets it? Even if you're a tycoon in Shanghai and you have $10 billion in the bank, still you cannot have this new treatment that will extend your life by 20 years because nobody else can get it? Or you say, no, okay, this is the perk for the tycoons, they can live forever. Ordinary humans, they can't. This is not basic to live forever.
Yeah, but I mean, probably we have to decouple that question from the question of UBI.
But this is the question of what is basic.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever people get, they take for granted. So if you come, say, today to poor people in France, and you say to them, what are you complaining about? You have better healthcare than Louis XVI. Because Louis XVI, he did not have antibiotics. If he had to pull a tooth out, they did not have anesthetics, and you have it. So what do you complain? People will not react very kindly to this line of argument. Because, and rightly, they will say, I don't compare myself to Louis XVI. I compare myself to the rich people here in France today. So in 50 years, if you can provide much better healthcare than today to all the population, but a small elite, say 1%, get to live forever and have superhuman babies, then people will not look back and say, well, but we have better healthcare than in 2018. They will say, we don't care about what was in 2018, now it's 2080. And we are very upset, we are very angry that we have to die at 110, while these rich people, they get to live to 1,000.
As an historian, maybe you may think that it's always been the case, right? The elite has always enjoyed a better lifestyle than other people. So it's not new in the history of humanity.
Oh, certainly not new. And although the anger about it is not new, but if universal basic, if some people have this fantasy that universal basic income will resolve the social tensions because it will just provide people with what they need, it will never do that. Because yes, maybe it will provide basic things, but then the whole political argument And a lot of anger and rage will be about the unbasic things, and there will always be unbasic things. Now, in a scenario in which many people don't work, and they rely on universal basic, I mean, today, you can have this kind of libertarian response that, well, go out there and work hard, be creative, be disciplined, and you can become a billionaire, and you can have all of that. And some people are convinced by this. But in a future scenario in which many people don't have any job, and they rely only on UBI, you can't tell them, well, if you really want this, you can go and work. We don't have a job. How can we work hard? We only have UBI. So the anger about what's not included in the UBI is likely to be much, much worse than the social tensions we've seen in the past or we see today.
Right, and then you can also say it's much better than the current situation, right? Where you have zero UBI, so you have to work for a living, otherwise you don't live.
I mean, again, you could provide people with better conditions than today, but the problem is that people almost never compare themselves to the past. They compare themselves to their neighbors today. So yes, I mean, with the development of technology, it is plausible that we can provide everybody with better healthcare than today, but they will still be extremely angry because they will look at their neighbors who have much more, and not at their ancestors who had much less.
Yeah, I'd like to continue on that, but we need to switch to the next policy, if you want, which is the ownership of data, and especially the ownership of personal data. Because you make that point in the book. You don't develop it quite long, but you're saying that who owns the data is really the most crucial question of our times. And then basically what you're saying is, for the moment, who owns the data is, companies, right? Because we click on those terms and conditions that we don't understand all day long, and then they get collected and accumulated by companies who are then allowed to sell them back. And you don't get anything in exchange for that except free service, which to me is very comparable to feudalism, right? When all your production is being taken, and in exchange you get protection against war or the use of the communal mill, which, by the way, already at that time was a monopoly. You couldn't build your own mill. So it's very comparable. But then you're saying there are two options that are on the table. Private data ownership, where you actually own your own data as you own your house or you own your car, or collective data ownership, like a commons of data. And I'd like you to dwell a bit on that, because I'm personally very much in favor of the private data ownership scheme, where at least if you own your data, well, first of all, you can value your data financially, but you can also trade your data however you want. So if you want to give them up, you can select which data you want to give to which sector, to which association. You can retain your data, you can access services without sharing your data and compensating those services in exchange to the government. And collective data ownership then brings back the problem of governance, which in a world where data are by nature global, it's almost unsolvable. I mean, it's all very, very well-intentioned to say we will collectively own our data, but our data are global, so are we going to set up a general UN assembly of data owners and set up our own rules? Whereas when you have private data ownership, then everybody sort of decides on its own formula and sort of contractually decides who gets the data that he provides. But I agree with you that if we don't have that, then it's not only a question of economic inequalities that have been created, but also a question of leaving yourself up to manipulation.
Yeah, well, maybe first we'll say a few words about the importance of this data and in collecting it. So to give an example of what it means in practical, say, economic terms. your DNA scan and your medical data is today extremely important economically. Because let's say a company collects DNA samples from 10 million people and their entire medical records, and then uses it for medical research and discovers that, say, a particular gene is responsible for a particular disease, or that this particular drug works best with people who have this genetic profile. And then it uses it to provide expensive medical treatment and consultation and earns billions and billions of dollars. Now, the company used my data and my medical records to reach these findings, which is the basis of its wealth. But it didn't pay me anything. In many cases, I don't even know that they used my data. And nobody asked me, do you allow it? And nobody offered to give me royalties. Like, if they use 10 million people for that and they make $10 billion, so each person should get so and so many dollars, because it's like an investment. It doesn't work like this today. And so people say, okay, so let's have a system in which I own my medical data. I can decide to give it to this company, not that company, because they offer me better conditions. And I have a small share in the company. And if they make billions of dollars by the research on my data, I should get a piece of that. Exactly. And this could be an alternative to UBI. Maybe you don't need to go to the factory, but your data is your most important asset.
Actually, you have a startup in New York which is trying to do exactly that.
Yeah, and there are a lot of interesting schemes going in this direction, and a lot of starting to have interesting research in economics, in law, on how to do it. And I think it's a very promising, I think it's much more promising to some extent than UBI. To think about, like you have even on the collective level of countries, just as if you're a company that goes now to Argentina and mines iron, you have to pay the Argentinians something for the iron you mine there. But if you go to Argentina and mine data, you don't pay the Argentinians anything. It's your data, it's my data, what do you want? But it shouldn't be like this. Just as we have an organization of oil exporting countries, OPEC, we can have an organization of data exporting countries. And countries that don't have any AI industry, they can still have a share in the game because they often produce a lot of the data, which is then, otherwise we'll have a kind of data colonialism in which you have an imperial hub in Silicon Valley or in Eastern China, and you have data colonies in Africa and Latin America and other places, maybe even Europe. And they mine raw data in the colonies and then process it in the imperial hub, and it comes back as products, like medical products, which cost a lot of money. And we saw this in the 19th century. And I think we can try to do better in the 21st century. Now, the key issue is how do you regulate the ownership of data? And this is very problematic. It's not impossible, but we can hardly even conceptualize it. We have good experience and concepts about ownership of land. Like, there is a field, I place a wall around the field, there is a gate, I decide this is my field, I decide who comes in and out.
But that took centuries as well to have the cadastre.
Yeah.
It took centuries
to
get
a long time to
cadastres
develop this.
in UK, in France.
Yeah, with data, we have no experience and we have no way to conceptualize it. Like, data is not like a field. I can't, like my DNA, you can have a printout. You can print out I can do a DNA scan, you can do a printout, oh, I have my data, I put it in a safe. No, you don't. You can have 1 million copies of this DNA scan, and you can send them all over the world in the speed of light.
Like intellectual property.
Yeah, so exactly, we don't have the legal structures to give people real ownership of, for example, their medical data. And how do you decide? I mean, there are very interesting ideas about starting basically kind of trade unions for data owners. Yeah. Because I can't negotiate myself a treaty with Amazon or Baidu or Alibaba.
There will be intermediaries.
But yeah, if I belong to a data trade union with 10 million other people, And the union negotiates for all of us a good deal with Alibaba, and they go to Alibaba, they go to Amazon, what do you offer, and negotiates on our behalf. We can get a much better deal. But we are just taking the first baby steps on, most people are in there. What does it mean, a trade union of data owners? Just try to explain it to most people.
Yeah, that's Glenn Wild's idea, in the US.
Yeah.
But the response of the French and the European regulator on this very topic of private data ownership, what they're saying is, because data is an emanation or a reflection of the self, and because the self is inalienable and cannot be traded, then if we start trading data, we'll end up trading kidneys. That's what they're saying. So don't you think that in order to do that, we need to change our very definition of what a subject is? And to say, at least that's my point, I know it's a bit far-fetched, and to say, well, we should switch from a definition of which is a Roman law definition of a subject against objects, and to say that we are self-owned, and we self-own ourselves. Have you had any reflection on that?
Yeah, I think this is right, going to the right direction, because this really goes to very deep philosophical issues. Because yes, it's to own a field is something very different than to own what does it mean that I own my DNA? To a large extent, my DNA owns me. The type of things that Amazon wants from me is not property. It basically wants, an insight into my life, into my habits. It wants to know what I like, what I don't like, what I do, what I don't do, what time I wake up in the morning, what movies I watch, what food I eat. And so I'm not selling, in this hypothetical trade union of data owners, I'm not selling Amazon my objects or even my labor. I'm selling it my life. Yes. I'm selling it information about what they want to know who I am better than I know who I am. Yeah. And what does it mean for, say, Amazon to know me better than I know myself? They know I gave them permission, my trade union gave them permission with a 500 long pages legalese text. It says basically that they can spy on me all the time and use that data to develop better products, and in exchange they transfer to my bank account every month so and so many euros, which this is what I use to learn how to play the violin. But I don't even realize...
You play violin, by the way.
And I don't even realize that 24 hours a day, they are watching me to learn how I function in order to produce better products.
Yeah, but that data ownership would allow you to regain control on that contractually. Because privacy will become a tradable good, in a way.
Yeah, but for most people it would be extremely difficult to act. This is, again, why you need these trade unions, or why is these organizations. Because it's so complicated. Most people don't understand the technology involved. They don't understand the biology, the computer science, the legal issues. So, we have this system now that when you download an app, so the first thing you need to do, you have this long legal document that you have to say, I agree. Yeah. How many people actually read the document? They made an experiment, I think, last year in some university, that the first sentence of this document was something like, I agree that I'm a slave for life and they can take my kidneys. Something really ridiculous. And everybody just did, I agree, because nobody reads it.
Yeah. No, I think the terms and conditions of PayPal are longer than Hamlet, and probably less exciting.
Less exciting.
and you cannot negotiate them, right? Maybe the last policy I wanted to tackle is education. And you already mentioned the fact that we will need to update ourselves all through our lives, and that's quite a tiring process. And when you're 40, 50-year-old, maybe you get exhausted of reinventing yourself every couple of years. It's nice to say that we reinvent ourselves, but it's also something that takes a toll, right, psychologically. But more fundamentally, I wondered what's the best education system in that world? Is it an education system that gives you all those skills that you will need in a given period to access those technologies? Or is it just the opposite? Is it an education that gives you, classic literature and philosophy and teaches you antique morals? There is I don't know if you know, there is an American educationalist called E.D. Hirsch, and he said, well, we need to switch back from skill-based education to content-based education, because you cannot forge critical, for instance, if you want to be critical, right, to have critical spirit, that cannot be taught. You need to teach people something on which they can exercise that kind of attitude. And so it's the idea that you cannot really teach skills, you can only teach content. So where are you placing yourself on that debate, and what sort of education system, even at the basic level of kids and secondary education, which we have?
Yeah, I think that the main problem with teaching skills is that we don't know which skills will be needed in 20 or 30 years. And most likely people will need to again and again learn new skills as the technology changes and the job market and society change and so forth. So a skill-oriented education doesn't seem like a good idea. The most important thing will be to learn how to learn how to change and reinvent yourself throughout your life, which means to have a very flexible mind. And that's a very big challenge, how to form flexible and balanced minds. And here things like philosophy can be extremely helpful. And also other things, from playing the violin to doing yoga, a lot of things that have relatively little place in traditional, at least education of the last century or two. I think, again, any discussion of education should start from the realization that we don't know which kind of world people will inhabit in 30 or 40 years. So it has, so the main thing is flexibility. And if in the past, education was, like building a stone house with very deep, solid foundations for your personality, for your skills, now it's a bit more like constructing a tent that you can fold and move very quickly. Because you will need to change much more than in any previous time in history.
And do you see countries today around the world that are moving into that direction? For instance, in China, what they do now in the classrooms, they put cameras, not only to watch the kids, but also they put an AI system in the network. And what they do, they try to identify the patterns that work through controlling and identifying the behavior of the pupils. And they will say, well, when the teacher is behaving in such a way, then the pupils react well, otherwise they react badly, and so on. So they use those technologies to optimize, let's say, the way the education system works, which in a way is self-reinforcing. So do you see in any part of the world an education system that you find is particularly valuable or particularly aware of those challenges?
I'm not an expert, and I haven't done any research on comparing different educational systems, so I really can't say. Certainly there are new initiatives that try to use the new technology in exactly the way you described, that using surveillance and AI to basically, while the student is learning, the system is studying the student and what works and what doesn't work and how to improve and optimize. And this can go in very positive ways. Creating an education system which is tailored to particular individuals. You don't have a class of 30 students that all learn in the same way, but you have basically a private AI mentor, which over time gets to know you and your particular weaknesses and strengths and what works for you and what doesn't work, and it's more and more adapted to you. On the other hand, it can go also in terrible directions of if the ones that are running the system have the wrong values or the wrong aims, and they say they want to instill obedience about everything else. So the system learns how to break each individual and how to make each individual the most obedient in the most efficient way, and if somebody is just beyond repair, they throw him in somewhere. So this can also, the same merger of surveillance and AI can be used to create the most totalitarian educational and social systems that we've ever seen in history. So we need to be very aware both of the positive and the negative potential of these technologies in the field of education.
And I don't know if we will maybe conclude on that, but I like the quote that you make of Brave New World on the right to be unhappy. Isaiah Berlin has an expression which I love to quote as well, which is the right to err. People needs to have periods or spaces in which they can make mistakes. And that's how cultural and social evolution actually proceeds, through mistakes, or in biological evolution. And I fear that in the systems that we have been describing over the past 2 hours, there is no room for mistakes. There is no room for serendipity in a way. And it's too tempting, because they provide well-being. And well-being is so attractive that nobody cares about the right to be unhappy when they can have the chance to be happy and to feel happy. So how do we, how do we rebel against such a system? How do we reclaim our right to be unhappy? That, Bhutan is putting up an happiness index. And in a way, it's the worst thing, right? To want your citizens to be happy. People also have the right to be irascible, to be different. So how do we enshrine that into our societies?
That depends to a large extent on what you define as happiness. If you equate happiness, Huxley was criticizing the simplistic understanding of happiness as pleasure. And the dystopian society which he envisioned is a society in which equates happiness with pleasure, and then with a very advanced biotechnology ensures, with drugs and so forth, that everybody is happy all the time, and therefore they never rebel against anything. Like it's the perfect totalitarian regime. You don't need concentration camps, you don't need secret police, because everybody is pleased all the time. If you define happiness in a different way, for example, happiness is knowing the truth about yourself, about reality, about the world, then this kind of situation this is why it is dystopian. Because in such a situation, the very incentive to start exploring the truth about yourself and the world doesn't exist. You're just content with whatever is. And this is one of the biggest questions about the new technologies and about the situation the world is in. And you're right that the right to err is inherent to this. If you go on like exploring who you are, you won't get it right the first time. You need to have room for exploration. And in many of the systems that today are being developed, you just don't have this room. So to give 2 examples, one system, like the system of social credits, which is being developed in China and other places, if you make an error, you might be trapped in it for the rest of your life. Like if you went to kindergarten, and for some reason you are a rebellious and problematic kid in kindergarten, the system surveils you all the time. And at age 6, when you need to go to school, then the best schools, they get the data from the kindergartens, and they know this is a problematic student. We don't want problematic students, so you don't get to the best school. You go to a mediocre or to a bad school. And then when you're 18 and you want to go to college, the college does the same thing. Looks at the records, not only of kindergarten, but also of school. And you see, hey, he went to a bad school, he was a bad student, we don't accept him. So you don't get to the best colleges. And then you don't get the best, and all because in kindergarten you were a naughty boy. And you can't escape it. In addition to the freedom to err, there is the freedom to forget, or to be forgotten. And in a total surveillance regime, nothing is ever forgotten. So whatever mistake you did at age 4 in kindergarten, it will haunt you throughout your life. And it will become worse and worse with time. So this is one example of this. Another example, and this brings us back to the beginning, was the discussion of liberal democracy and the rise of populism and authoritarian regimes today in the world. maybe one of the best things about liberal democracy is this ability to err. You vote for the wrong party, after 4 years, hopefully you realize you're a mistake, you vote for somebody else. One of the dangers we see now in the world is that no, you get to vote once. Once you get the wrong people in power, you never get a second chance. And that's the biggest danger. And I think we need to preserve this freedom to err, both in the political system and in the educational system and in society in general.
Well, I suggest that we conclude on that, the freedom to err. Thank you very much, Yuval, for your time.
Alors, merci beaucoup de